first and foremost, we need to encourage everyone to revalue agriculture in the sense of the national interest. How many of you have suddenly realised that people have begun to talk about the national interest again? It's remarkable. The national interest has disappeared from the public lexicon. For the last 4 or 5 years, and probably longer, people had stopped talking about what's the national interest. Suddenly, we've got national interest tests being applied to the media. But please, let's think about the national interest in terms of what still drives our national economy. Sure, agriculture is a smaller part, but you take agriculture out of the national economy and just see how much of the tertiary sector, of the services sector of the economy falls over as a result. Take mining out, see how much of the services sector falls apart as a result. So there are things that, in terms of the Australian economy, are very much in the national interest, and agriculture is one of those. Now, what we need to do is to translate what is obviously in our national interest back into education and research and development. If you don't do that, what you have is a research and development mix, an education mix, that is all governed by the alternative to national interest is the, if you like, the pole. If we're talking about two poles, one is the national interest, the other pole is the let all flowers bloom philosophy. That we in Australia should encourage all forms of education, all forms of R&D, and wherever excellence arises, that's what we support. That's great. That's great if you've got the United States economy or the economy of Germany. But if you're a small economy in the world, and there are a very few things in your economy that the rest of the world is interested in, trying to have a let all flowers bloom approach to education and to research and development is, in my view, a very dangerous and very difficult path to tread. You would need to have extraordinary wisdom to be able to take out of a let all flowers bloom philosophy to find those things that are really going to support the national interest if you don't set it out in the first place. So much of what I've got to say here today is to encourage all of us to take our own role, whatever role that is, whatever employment we have, to think about whatever parts of Australian society that we can influence, to remind people that in the national interest, it is very much the case that we need to focus our education and our R&D efforts in areas that really matter to our economy. So let me give you a couple of examples. The Australian Research Council is widely regarded as the premier source of funding for basic research in Australia. If you go back 20 years, there was a part of the Australian Research Council that was called the panel that focused on agricultural and forest, but agricultural R&D. That no longer exists. We don't have any part of the Australian Research Council that is focused on agricultural R&D or the basic research that supports agricultural industries. That's happened in part because of the success of the Rural Research Development Corporations, the RDCs as they're called. We are in part a victim of the success of the RDC model. The RDCs have been wonderful. We are regarded around the world as an innovator in R&D funding because of the Research and Development Corporation model. But at the same time, they've left behind this large gap in funding of basic research, which is the prerogative of the Australian Research Council. But the Australian Research Council says, well, if this is research on the basic fundamentals of plant growth or soils or water, then that can be done by the RDCs. So we end up with this gap in between what's very good, highly productive research being done by the RDCs and the basic research which is supported through the Australian Research Council. But you can't get a grant to work on fundamental properties of soils or plants if your focus is agriculture. The numbers of grants that are focused on, so these are numbers of grants in basic research that are clearly agricultural in intent and purpose, has shrunk to sub 10. Soil science, one of Australia's most important disciplines, something upon which most of our agriculture is based, that our ability to get ourselves at the head of the pack in understanding how to manage difficult soils is now much reduced. I'm hesitant to say we're now a follower. We are still a leader in soil science, but we have nowhere near the lead we once had. Now, part of this, though, also stems from the nature of our universities. And in my written paper, I'm probably harder on the universities than I am on anything else. But one of the great difficulties here is, of course, that over the years, there's been a massive growth in the number of universities and in the disciplines that are taught and researched in universities. This has all followed the let all flowers bloom philosophy that has been pursued now for many years in this country. So having a lot more researchers, academics, and a lot more universities all looking for funding means that those who have stayed or are academic researchers involved in agricultural research are competing. This is just an axiomatic. It's something that's as true as night follows day. You've got more researchers, more fields. The agricultural researchers in Australian universities are now much of a minority. If you went back 20, 30 years, they were a very significant proportion of the university research community. So we have many more researchers in many more fields. They now dominate the Australian Research Council. If you go through the membership of the panels that make the decisions, you hardly find someone from an agriculture faculty. So this Australian Research Council, which serves everybody and is very well run, properly run, no question about it. This is not a matter of inbuilt bias in the Australian Research Council. It's simply that it reflects the corpus of researchers and teachers in Australian universities. And so with many more researchers, with many more interests, it's axiomatic that agriculture was always going to shrink down. And that's what's happened. Now, when that sort of thing happens, it needs very strong leadership and clear decision-making to reverse the trend. So when I say we need to go back to having a panel on the Australian Research Council that's focused on agriculture, that's not, it's my one-liner, easy to say, hard to implement. We've got to have to work very hard to get there. Equally, the focus of research and development in Australia is very much a part of our ability to deliver education. Because Australian universities value, what do you see in the headlines from Australian universities? What you see is our latest discovery. That's when you see in the newspapers routinely is our latest discovery. And we now discover things right across the board.